For today's video, we're just going to focus on China, a country in transition. We're going to talk about the way that China has been changing as a country. We're going to first talk about its economic reforms, then its political reforms, its cleavages, and how those cleavages are providing for some opportunities for transition, obviously not all of which are positive. We're going to talk about China's civil society and the way the Communist Party is changing. And then my hope is that at the end you will take a quiz to measure your level of understanding in Canvas. And I haven't done that before, so this will be exciting. So to start off, we're going to talk about the economic reforms and changes that have happened in China. These started with Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s. Nowadays, people would talk about China as having a socialist market economy or state capitalism. It's still a closed economic system, especially in comparison to the United States, in that there are only zones of the country that have capitalism, but it is not like a traditional command economy. And when I refer to a traditional command economy, I'm talking about like the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, there weren't any privately owned companies. Everything was owned by the state, by the government. And so, but in China, there are government run businesses, but there are also privately run businesses. And so that is a difference. Now, we've already covered this idea of special economic zones in AP Human Geography. They started under Deng Xiaoping. They are Western companies and they can operate there, and they have been successful and they've expanded. All these special economic zones are on that eastern border of China in the Pacific Ocean, and they offer tax breaks to incentivize foreign investment. And like pretty much everybody's Apple phone is made in China in one of these special economic zones. Another thing that Deng used was in rural areas, he set up township and village enterprises where they have these rural factories and they're becoming a fast growing sector. And if you think back to the video that we saw when we were talking about industrialization, and they talked about the town that was having a clothing factory that was set up, and how some people were still growing subsistence agriculture and other people were working in this factory in town. That was an example of this township and village enterprise. Deng Xiaoping also pushed the privatization of farms. Now they had collective farmings under Mao Zedong when the Communist Revolution came to China, just like how they had collective farms in Russia and the Soviet Union. But Deng pushed this idea of privatization of farms, and now most farms in China are private. This is called the household responsibility system. And what they do is 1% of their crop goes to the state, and 1% of their crop they get to sell on their own for profit. And you also saw that in the video that we watched in AP Human Geography. For private enterprise, entrepreneurship, what happened is that they sold off some state-owned enterprises since 1990 in an effort to try to get there to be some more privately run companies and some more international investment to come into China. Okay? What the impact of this is that it has really been sort of chipping away at this idea of the iron rice bowl. If you look at the cartoon above, the person is upset about the fact that the iron rice bowl is being chipped away at. The idea under Mao Zedong in the Communist Revolution was there's a guarantee of basic human needs being met, like full employment and health care. And the idea is that these things are actually not promises in the same way that they used to be, because now if you're transitioning from having government-owned corporations to private corporations, it means that you actually have your own, some of that responsibility is your own. Okay? If you look at what are sort of the consequences of these economic changes, is it's led to rapid urbanization, so people are moving from the rural areas to the urban areas and hoping to be able to get jobs. Think back to the Sicha video that we saw, that small town that I was just referring to outside of Shanghai, that people are moving. You've got migration from rural areas, and we saw some quotes about that in the Economist article that you're doing for an activity this week. It's causing significant environmental problems in terms of air pollution, habitat loss, land contamination, urban sprawl, water pollution. And this is due to economic liberalization because it means that these industries have expanded quickly and rapidly with very little government oversight. There's also been a huge increase in the average amount of money that your average Chinese person earns, which has led to a dramatic increase in consumption, and that's led to a huge increase in infrastructure, and all of that has had an economic consequence. Like, for example, there's over 1 billion people who live in China. Well, if most Chinese people can afford a car, that has a big impact on the environment in a way that it doesn't in a smaller country. The other issue that China has is that its growth is slowing down. And so they have had rapid growth for decades, and so it is slowing down, which then means that now the Chinese government is sort of having this debate about how do we keep this growth? Do we keep opening ourselves up to the West? Do we keep expanding capitalism, or do we control capitalism sort of where it is? And there's some debate about that within the Chinese Communist Party. China has been trying to address these environmental issues by shutting down polluting factories, increasing the planting of trees, increasing the use of solar. Actually, most of the solar panels in the world, I believe, are made in China. Making environmental laws and then actually enforcing them, and then starting to plan for the infrastructure, trying to plan for how the country is going to expand as opposed to just having it just expand so rapidly. Another area of change in China is in terms of political reform. And so, as you can see from this cartoon, economic reforms have been very big and very bold since the Deng Xiaoping era. But political reform has been slower, but it's important to acknowledge that it has still happened. In China, the government monitors local elections, but villagers get choice. And they can actually vote for who they want to have be their elected officials. You must be a member of the Communist Party to run, but you do not have to be picked by the Communist Party to run. State and national leaders are not voted on by your average Chinese person. You have to be a member of the Chinese Party to get to be involved in that. But the fact that there are now sort of these local democratic elections at the local level is a big change. They've had a very successful and very public anti-corruption campaign. I gave you a quote of an example of this in the Economist piece in the discussion that you're doing this week on Canvas. They have anonymous hotlines that people can call in. There have been some really big names of famous Chinese leaders who've actually gotten like serious jail time in an effort to try to send a message which says that government officials are supposed to work for the people and not for their own personal economic happiness. They have been relaxing the one-child policy, as we talked about in AP Human Geography. So they used to have the one-child policy. However, that was only for Han Chinese, not for ethnic minorities. And now you can have more than one child, but you do have to pay more taxes. They have been letting capitalists join the Communist Party, and that is leading to factions, which we'll talk about on another slide. And they've also been having judicial reform. Now the Communist Party is requiring legal training and requiring there to be some sort of like systematization of like how judges make their decisions. Human rights groups still see punishments as extreme and arbitrary in China, but we have seen some changes with that. And if you take a look at the quotes from The Economist in the Canvas discussion, will give you some examples of that. It's important to remember that the theme of political and economic change, this is a core topic in the AP exam. So being able to talk about changes over time and being able to note if it's a political or economic or social reform or change is important. And you see this in terms of China, and the way it would show up on an AP exam would be like, they would be asking you to like compare the political reforms that have happened in China with the political reforms that have happened in Mexico, for example, or the economic reforms in China with the economic reforms in Mexico, which you have the ability to do. You have all that information. Next, I want to talk about China's cleavages. Okay, so China is the most populous country in the world. More than 1.3 billion people live there. However, even though it's also a very big geographically country, but if you notice, most of the people live on the southern and seaboard parts of the country. Okay? It's a homogeneous population. 90% of the people who live there are Han Chinese. But within that 10% of people who are not Han Chinese, there are actually 55 minority nationalities. Wow, that's a lot. If you look at their key minority groups, I try to focus on with you just two groups, okay? There are more than two, but I'm focusing on two. One is the Muslim Uyghur population. So when it says Uighur, that's Uyghur, and they are in northern China. And then the Tibetans are in a semi-autonomous region in the southwest. Okay, and so if you look at those two areas, they're very big size pieces of land, but there aren't actually that many people that live there because it's not actually the most productive farmland. It's not actually the most hospitable environment. And your book talks about the fact that there have been sort of different crackdowns in different periods against these different groups. The Uyghur Muslim people your book talks about in 2009, but some would argue there's one happening right now. And then in the Tibetans, your book talks about in 2008. Okay. Many minorities live in these strategic autonomous areas that actually make up 60% of China's territory. So if you think about it, the areas where the Han Chinese are is actually the most populated areas. The places where ethnic minorities live is actually the places where it's the least populated. The government uses three main strategies to try to deal with keeping these minority populations a part of China and to try to keep them a part of their government. They use three strategies: co-optation, assimilation, and repression. Obviously, repression would be sort of like your last strategy and the one that you definitely don't want to have to use. The Chinese government has extended special protection to minority ethnic groups in an effort to try to keep them happy and a part of China. And some of these special minority protections include language rights, exceptions to population control, like they didn't have to follow the one-child policy, having their own educational curriculum and language study in their own schools. Legislative seats are reserved for members of these minority groups. They have autonomous regions, and they have the right to practice their religion in these autonomous regions. The China government does this in order to decrease conflict, to try to prevent separation. They really want to have these areas a part of China. They provide them with a natural defense against other countries, but also particularly in the Uyghur area, it's a very important strategic area for an oil and gas pipeline. They want to increase their legitimacy to the international community as well as to their own people. They want increased access to these natural resources. They want to improve their global image. And as I said, they also want to create a buffer with other states. The other cleavage that I think is most important for us to talk about is this cleavage between urban versus rural. Most of the people in China live obviously in the urban areas, not in the rural areas. But the rural areas are more underdeveloped and have a higher degree of poverty. And so people want to move from those rural areas to the urban areas. But the Chinese government, as we talked about before, wants to have planned development. They want to not have increasing environmental problems. They want to not have increasing poverty in these cities. And so they're telling people in these rural areas, no, you need to stay there. We will send resources to you. The people in the rural areas are like, no, this isn't happening fast enough. And so, but the problem is that if you are a rural person and you move to an urban area in China, you have a card that says where you're supposed to receive your services from. And if this card says that you're supposed to be staying in that rural area, you cannot get government services in that urban area. And so this has become a conflict, which is that there are groups of sort of slums that are developing in these urban areas of people that are not technically, according to the Chinese government, supposed to be there. And so there's this divide and this rift between urban Chinese and rural Chinese about how to take care of the economic inequality that exists between these two areas. In Chinese civil society, there are a couple key things that we want to talk about. I want to remind you that civil society, when we as political scientists use this term, we're talking about the aggregation of, or the collective total of NGOs, non-government organizations and institutions that represent the interests and the will of the people. In China, they have what are called gongos, government-operated non-governmental organizations, and the Chinese government uses these in order to try to control society and to mobilize social groups to fulfill national goals. And so, if you are in the Women's Federation, the All China Federation, the Youth Development Foundation, you are assisting in party or state matters, and you're actually implementing policy, but you're doing this hand in glove with the government. You're not doing this as a separate entity that is trying to influence the government. So it's not like how an interest group would operate in the United States. We're going to see this term again of patron-client relations, which we've talked about before, like with Mexico. Relationships in which powerful government officials deliver state services. And so the idea is that if you are working with the Communist Party, you are getting their rewards to that. If you're trying to operate outside of the Communist Party, there are definite barriers that come up for you. Non-governmental organizations are definitely get some pushback from the Chinese government. You see that in the cartoon from The Economist. There's definitely a sort of push and pull in that non-governmental organizations, frequently like Western human rights groups, are in China trying to report on what they see as human rights problems and trying to really point the finger at China. And China sees this as like you're operating, trying to represent what the United States wants or what the European Union wants. And so there's definitely a clash that happens from time to time where, for example, NGOs from the West can actually be kicked out of China. Another group of people that operate in Chinese civil society are called red capitalists. They are private entrepreneurs who actually belong to the Communist Party. As I said on a previous slide, now you don't have the same ideological requirement to join the Communist Party, and so you have a bigger diversity of what people believe in within the Communist Party, which is going to lead to factions on another slide. Also, your book talks about the fact that the Falun Gong is not seen by the Communist Party as a legitimate religious minority group in China. I don't really understand a lot about the Falun Gong. When I do research about them, sometimes they're talked about as a martial arts group. Sometimes they're talked about as a religious group. Sometimes I don't really understand who they are, what they represent. But they have organized protests against the government, and those protests have been repressed by the Chinese government. There are about 200 million migrant workers in China, and a lot of them are sort of in this weird position where they're very poor, but they don't necessarily get access to government resources because, as I talked about before, if they don't have the right ID card, then the government is like, you're not supposed to be here. You're supposed to be back in your home province. And then lastly, political scientists really like to talk about the internet usage in China. They have 500 million, they're called netizens, so like people who use the internet in China. And so anytime, and the Chinese government, just like, for example, when we talk about Iran, tries to really monitor and limit what people can see online. And so that is a way that people can try to organize together in China, but also sometimes that is made complicated by the fact that the Chinese government has its own controls over that as an organizing or communication method within people within China. If you look at the Chinese government, it operates in a very different way than any of the other countries that we're going to talk about in this case study. I really want to highlight the chart that's in your book on page 432 in O'Neill. And it talks about this idea of parallel organization. So all of the key decision-making offices, all the key decisions happen on the left side of the chart. Okay, so if the decision is made by the Communist Party, then that is where the decision is actually happening. Okay, it might actually happen in the world of political theater on the right side of the chart. Like, so for example, at the National People's Congress, they have 2,987 members, and they meet like once a year, and they vote on things. But the decision was already made at the National Party Congress, which was internal and which you had to be a Communist Party member to be a part of. And then the National People's Congress is basically voting on things officially, but those decisions have already been made internally. Your book talks about the fact that China has a president, Xi Jinping. But in reality, the president gets his authority because he also happens to be the general secretary of the Communist Party. Okay. And so it's important to sort of understand this idea of parallel organization, that they have parallel structure. And so that you can't just think of the Chinese government outside of the Communist Party in China, because the Communist Party is the government of China, which is different from any of the other countries that we're going to talk about. There have been a lot of changes to the Communist Party in China. So the Communist Party under Mao Zedong, he was the original founder. He's the one who led the Communist Revolution. He had a real emphasis on recruiting members of the working class. Most members had been in the military and the People's Liberation Army and actually fought the Communist Revolution. There was a real belief and a need for ideological purity, that what they wanted the most was true communists, and the people worked their way up the military or the party ranks. In modern communist China, people have seen some real differences. Most leaders now are university trained. Most leaders are technocrats, which is a term political scientists talk about, in that they are experts in their field, in business, finance, engineering, as opposed to experts in communist ideology or political philosophy. The party has become very pragmatic, and so they're looking for members with greater levels of technical expertise. So it's more important to them now that you are an expert in engineering than you are an expert in understanding communism. They have also made the decision that members can be capitalists. And this grooming for party leadership positions happens through the Communist Party, and frequently people get promoted through family connections. This term of guanxi, Guanxi, that people with connections have disproportionately benefited from this change to economic liberalism. That is a similarity with Russia. And so that is something when people make these comparisons between how China has changed and Russia have changed, they've done that. Take a look at the white question. How have these changes of who is in the party changed Chinese public policy? And how have these changes affected party unity? Take a moment to answer that question and press pause on the video. These changes in Chinese public policy are that they've led to the creation of special economic zones, free market reforms, economic liberalization, these steps away from having a planned economy like the 5-year plan. And now in China, they have more international trade and foreign investment. They now have a government that's more pro-globalization, more open to allowing people to have private property. So those are some big changes. How this has affected party unity, that's been a pretty big change. In China now they have only the Communist Party is allowed to run for office and is only allowed to be in the government. But within the Communist Party, there are two factions. There's the populist faction and the elitist faction. Your book also talks about them as the princelings, okay? So the populist faction believes that you should go back to the Communist Party under Mao. The elitist factions are okay with the guanxi, with the fact that there are people with connections who are getting positions. People in the elitist faction feel comfortable with this moving towards capitalism, moving towards more private accumulation of wealth. I think that these changes are important to understand because one of the questions that you are going to be asked is whether or not China is still a communist country. And there's actually considerable debate about this in political science circles. And my hope is that between your book and the readings we're doing this week, you will be able to write me an incredibly persuasive essay on whichever direction you take that answer. Thank you.